Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom. Giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Bashem Yahushai, Bashem Makakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, for teaching us his truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to go through, your offering, and basically just going through a little bit about first fruit offerings. Basically, within our culture, we used to give. I'll read it, but something, was an offering of the first fruits, right? And we will give a lot of our substance, basically, put it in a basket, and it would be given to as an offering unto the Lord, and then this would be basically used to take care of our priests, right? So I wanted to kind of equate that to like in today's time, like even though we don't actually are in our land, right, and we don't actually have the substance, because the scriptures talk about when you go into curses, it talks about how we would go to the enemies for the want of all things, right? So that includes the substance that we have. Yes, you might have bits and pieces of our people. They might own certain things, but even in where all the different tribes are situated today, you have a lot of Esau and their companies, Moab and their companies, situated where in different parts of for different islands, and they own a lot of the substance that our people don't actually get the opportunity to use, right? So I wanted to kind of go through this, just to read through this like real quick, and basically your offering and how the Lord can remember your offering is basically in a time of trouble, right? So as a matter of fact, I'll start off with this one precept here, then I'll go to first fruits, right? Because there's something I always think about in terms of the sacrifice of Cain and then the sacrifice of Abel. And the Lord had respect unto Abel's sacrifice. So basically just putting something, having a sacrifice that's basically like, okay, because respect really means to look back, right? You know what I'm saying? So having a pleasing sacrifice, right? And a lot of our people see the men of the Lord basically as an opportunity to scoff and mock and so on and so forth, right? But if you were sincere, like if you're somebody and you're listening and you're sincere and you wanted to actually, man, you're very galvanized to, not only just repent, but to actually, do something to help them out. Like, that can go a long way. You know what I'm saying? Even though we don't put that financial burden upon our people, because as Paul said, basically we have a essentially like a dispensation, right? We would continue to teach and minister anyways, regardless, because Paul even said as well, I have not coveted no man's gold or silver, right? And that is an attitude that you would see amongst our apostles and elders and brothers on down, but that's not an attitude that's strongly exemplified when you look at the mannerisms of these other camps, where they basically are trying to swindle their congregation and holding back pieces and telling you that certain things are not important, and the heir is basically not knowing the scriptures, right? So I just wanted to just play around with this idea, and Lord's will, this lesson would just be quick and edifying. But let me start off with this precept first, and then I'll read a little bit about the first fruits, right? This is Peter chapter 4, verse 7, and it says here, but the end of all things is at hand. And it says, therefore sober, and watch unto prayer. And it says, above all things, it says, have fervent charity among yourselves. For charity shall cover a multitude of sins, right? So we're in a situation, we when we have we basically have transgressed. We understand that, but you can use, whether it's in you might be like a help, for example, and you might have a particular gift, you can use that to be able, as an offering of your own, to be able to help men of the Lord, right? And I want to get that a little bit. I'm going to get some examples of that, later on, right? But just to get an understanding of what first fruits was, and basically because the understanding of, providing an offering, a sacrificial offering, that mindset hasn't gone away. It's just we don't do the whole, like, for example, like I've mentioned earlier about animal sacrifices. Yes, we don't have our substance and so on and so forth, right? So I just wanted to read a little bit of this. So this is Deuteronomy 26, verse 1 here. And the title on the top, it says, offering of first fruits. And it says, and I'll read down, and it shall be, when thou art come into the land which the Lord Yahweh thy power giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it and dwell therein, that thou shalt take the first of all the fruit of the earth. And it says, which thou shalt bring of thy land, which the Lord Yahweh thy power giveth thee, and put it in a basket, and shall go unto the place which the Lord thy power shall choose to place his name there. And thou shalt go unto the priest, and shall be in those days, and say unto him, I profess this day unto the Lord thy power, that I am come into the country where the Lord sware unto our fathers for to give us. And the priest shall take the basket out of thine hand, and set it down before the altar, thy power, and thou shalt speak and say before the Lord Yahweh thy power, thy Syrian was ready to perish for my father, and went down into Egypt, and sojourned there a few, and became there a great nation, became there a nation great, mighty, and populous. So basically, when we sojourned in Egypt, and, we started to basically multiply. And the king at that time, there was a Pharaoh at that time that did not know Joseph, our forefather. And, they got kind of nervous, what I'm saying? we were multiplying, like crazy, right? But it was it was hardcore captivity, right? So verse 6 here, and it says, and the Egyptians in evil entreated us and afflicted us and laid upon us hard bondage, right? So it was rigorous, rigorous captivity, and then it says, and we cried unto the Lord Yahweh of our fathers. The Lord heard our voice and looked upon our affliction and our labor and our oppression. And the Lord brought forth out of Egypt a mighty hand, and stretched with an outstretched arm, and great terribleness, with signs and wonders. So those different plagues that Egypt, was plagued with, what I'm saying? That's in Exodus, the 7th, I believe the 8th as well, chapter, right? And it says, and the Lord brought us forth out with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, with great terribleness, with signs and with wonders. And it says, and he hath brought us into this place, hath given us this land that floweth with milk and honey. So the land basically had a lot of substance. For example, you have dates and pomegranates, figs, all these different, when you think about, a land, it has, lots of, what's it called? It's very fruitful, no pun intended, right? It's very rich in different, crops and so on and so forth, right? And basically that was basically our inheritance. So, fast forward during the time of Joshua, we went in, we got rid of those different, Canaanite, nations, and, the land was basically divided, amongst the 12 tribes, right? They received their inheritance, and understanding that during that time as well, that was basically our, what do you call it, our living, because you didn't have supermarkets back then, so you would use and utilize the land to be able to take care of your animals, cattle, sheep, goats, whatever, whatever it was. And, you had trees, you had substance, right? So that was our living. That's how we lived. It was more of, we were living off the land, so to speak, right? So it says here, let me continue on. And it says, and he hath brought us, I'll read verse 10. And it says, and behold, I have brought the first fruits out of the land, which the Lord Yahweh, which thou, O Lord, Yahweh, hath given me, and shall set it before the Lord thy power, worship before the Lord thy power. And it says, and thou shalt rejoice in every good thing, and the Lord thy power hath given thee, and unto thine house, thou and a Levite, a stranger, is among you. When thou hast made an end to tithing, and all the tithes of thine increase the third year, which is the year of tithing, hast given unto the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, that they may eat within the gates and be filled, right? So, all these different the substance that was collected, it was done, and it would help take care of, these particular people, right? So you have the strangers, so you have like Israelites that might be coming in, and they would sojourn, right? Fatherless and the widows, right? So it was basically also like a social welfare system, to take care of those who were less fortunate. There's another custom within our culture where, when you have like, say for example, you had a vineyard, for example, you wouldn't glean all the portions, of that particular vineyard, right? You would leave a portion set aside for, for such like the strangers, the fatherless, the widows, people who are a little bit, who didn't have that, substance, right? But they were still Israelites, right? And to be able to help take care of them, right? That was, what people would call like social welfare, basically. It's a social safety net to be able to take care of them, right? And this is very, very, very important to keep in mind as well. Ultimately, in this time we understand that the Lord is the one to to take care of, us, that's taking care of us, that looks out for us, right? But if the because we don't put that essentially, that those, financial burdens, upon our people, but there's a lot of camps that have that mentality of trying to acquire, lots of money, right? As opposed to just, basically just teaching our people the truth and giving them understanding, that it makes you more pleasing in the sight of the Lord, especially in these times, right? So I wanted to just read a little bit of that, right? But, your offering, so to speak, or you might have a particular, for example, gift, that offering, can be able to, help, a godly man in these times. As a matter of fact, let me read that in the Apocrypha. Just give me 1 second. Let me get that. What's that? Sirach. This is Sirach chapter 12. I'll start at verse 1, the points in 2. And it says here, when thou wilt do good, know to whom thou doest it, so shalt thou be thanked for thy benefits. It says, verse 2, there is do good to the godly man, and thou shalt find a recompense, if not from him, yet from the Most High Yahweh. Right, so there is a recompense that you can receive, a godly, an upright, a righteous recompense if you do good to a godly man, right? So how much more, even though we don't actually, have the physical, substance to be able to provide, for the fatherless, the widow, the Levite, be able to take care of our priests in these times. You know what I'm saying? Even though we don't understand and we don't have that, that substance, that offering, you can still provide a good offering, unto, men of the Lord, or godly men, I should say. You know what I'm saying? As opposed to, going to for example, like the Catholic Church, where you don't actually receive anything. You don't actually receive any, understanding, in regards to, what's going on in these times, right? So, you might have, for example, a skill maybe in prayers. For example, you might be able to be, if you're a sister, you might be able to, offer, food, for example. Or it could be, like the like, giving is not just limited to like money. That's really the point I wanted to get, as well, right? It's not limited, to just money. It might be just a gift, and then that gift can actually help support, a local, camp, or, what I'm saying, like, men of the Lord within that area. A good example, there was a woman. When you go into the book of Kings, there was a woman, a widow, if I'm not mistaken. She was, during the time of the prophet Elijah, that woman, became like a somebody, that fed Elijah, that gave him food to eat, right? And that's, she gave the what basically, she was able to give within her power to be able to, take care of that man of the Lord at that time, because during that time, there was a famine, right? So the point is, the giving is not just limited to just money. Another good example, and another woman is Abigail. So during the time of David, when he was being sought after, by King Saul, David and his men, they needed, some substance, right? And Nabal he didn't want to give his substance, to David, to help David and his men. He had a bit of an attitude. Why should I give my son? Why should I give my substance to this son of Jesse, right? So to speak, right? And this is like post, fight after David defeated Goliath, right? So essentially, after that time, David, although he wasn't king, he was still somebody after the Most High's heart, right? And ultimately, he was on the come up, right? Eventually, he did become king, right? So, the so think about it as well, right? So, you can do good to, a godly man, right? That might just be like of the hopeful elect, right? Just thinking about that, so how much more? As a matter of fact, I'm gonna get one precept, and I'm gonna get a quick account as well. What's that? Matthew. Because you might be sincere in thinking about, like, well, okay, you might have a gift, right? The scriptures say a man's gift maketh room for him, right? I'm just gonna go to the strange. I'm just gonna go straight to the end, and it says here, Matthew chapter 10, verse 42. I'll start at verse 41, and it says, "And he that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he that receiveth a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whosoever shall give a drink to one of these little ones a cup of cold water, only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall in no wise lose his reward," right? So, something as simple as that, right? If you see, one second. So, how much more, can something as simple as that, can go? I'm just kind of just listing off a few examples, right? So you can actually, utilize, a gift that you might have, to be able to help godly men, within these times, like God, men that fear, the Heavenly Father, right? So how much more in these times? I'll end off with this quick account in Acts. And this is some of the things that some of the believers did during this time. This is Acts chapter 4. I'll start at verse 32, and it says the topic is sharing among believers. And it says, and the multitude of them that believe with one heart and one soul, neither of any of them had aught of things which he possessed was his own, but had all things common. And great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Yahushua, and great grace was upon them all. Neither was any of them that lacked. For as many that were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet. And the distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. So basically they were using the substance, and the substance they had sold it, and they had laid, those earnings, and they had put it, at the, brought it to the apostles, right? So how much more, this is during the time of Acts, right? So, there was basically, a lot of, they started, the apostles, the disciples that eventually became apostles, they had that, those, they were able to perform miracles, right? And then they were, basically just out there, and, out there, and, there were a lot of believers, Israelites at that time, they were just like, okay, I'm just gonna, sell this off. I'm just gonna, bring the money and, lay it at the apostles' feet, right? Verse 36, and it says, and Joseph, who was by the apostles' name, surnamed Barnabas, which is being interpreted, the son of consolation, a Levite, out of the country of Cyprus, having sold it, brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet, right? So, giving is not just limited to, money, right? Like I said earlier, if you're a sister, for example, and you're very talented with sewing, for example, these are things that can actually help the men of the Lord in these times, right? Like I said, this is not a video to try and cash grab or, grab possessions and so on and so forth, but it's also to understand that, our culture, and it's also to understand that, your offering can go a long way, right? Not just, for you to be more pleasing in the sight of the Heavenly Father through His Son, right? Because, what's cool about, for example, I'll say this about peace offerings. When you read in Leviticus, the 7th chapter, it gives you an outline of this particular sacrifice known as peace offerings. Now, during the Levitical priesthood, those kinds of offerings were done they were done more voluntarily, as an act of thanksgiving, right? And the fat, you trim the fat off, and it would be part of that offering would be taken, and it would be used to take care of the priests, right, and their families, right? So, they would be able to eat of that particular offering as well, right? So they got the shoulder and the thigh, right? So my point is, that offering was done, as an act of thanksgiving, thanking the Lord, as well as it was also done, and part of it was also shared with the priest. So how much more can your offering benefit, godly men, priests, bishops, apostles in these times, so to speak, right? So, and that's pretty much the point. I just wanted to go into this point, right? Because we have sins to pay for, right? And there's, the Lord sometimes will put us in opportunities to basically do essentially good, right? To exemplify these fruits of the spirit, so to speak, right? So I just thought I would just read this. I thought it was really cool. But Lord's will, this lesson was quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises going on into Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.